My name's Susan Park. I'm a Professor of Global Governance here at the University of Sydney, and I research critical minerals. So what are critical minerals? Minerals are supposedly critical to the renewable energy transition. So we know that there is a climate crisis which is intensifying, and we're all feeling the effects of that every day and watching it on the news from around the world. Critical minerals are what we need in terms of metals, materials and minerals for all of the renewable energies that we need. So wind, solar, lithium-ion batteries. This is the largest shift since the last industrial revolution. Everything we use depends on energy, and energy consumption is increasing at an ever rapid rate. So critical minerals like cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, these are what we need for solar, for wind and for batteries. I'm studying them because every country around the world has a separate critical minerals list. Sometimes they have a strategic minerals list as well. And these are what countries identify as most important, not just for the renewable energy transition, but for AI, for quantum, for digital technologies as we move into the future. But of course, this is leading to a race for critical minerals around the world. 60% of the minerals that we use are often located in hard-to-reach places with fragile political regimes. So cobalt largely comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a country known for its political instability and violence. So we know that the renewable energy transition is much more mineral and energy intensive than conventional or fossil fuel energy. It's driving a race to secure critical minerals from around the world, and we're starting to see geopolitical shifts between dependence on China for many of these minerals, not just for extraction but also for processing, and attempts by the West, particularly the United States and the European Union, to diversify their global supply chains of renewable energy, specifically for critical minerals. And so countries like Australia, which have a significant number of critical minerals, are now in a position of trying to ascertain how best to leverage their supply by looking towards the United States for what the US calls friendshoring. So this is aligning critical minerals supply and demand for allies rather than for countries with whom there may be tensions. This creates quite a significant problem because at this point, Australia largely just digs and ships their critical minerals. What does this mean? It means instead of processing the critical mineral at home, what Australia does is to dig up spodumene, which is the sort of original product for lithium, and ships it to China. China processes 60% of the world's lithium, and they then send it off for manufacturing to be used in a state for electric vehicles. So a lot of lithium actually goes through China. So this race for critical minerals is essentially about minerals that have no ready substitute for renewable energies. So we really do need the lithium, we do need the cobalt for our smartphones, but also for solar panels and wind turbines. And they really are at risk in terms of the vulnerability of the supply chain. So we can think about the supply chain as being vulnerable in a number of different ways. The first is that there is that geopolitical tension between the US and China. This has been building for decades, and some people now talk about this as the second Cold War. I think that's quite risky language and does feed into building up tensions and fear, but that's just my personal opinion. In terms of the supply vulnerabilities, we can think of this in terms of much larger concerns. So, for example, there could be another global pandemic. This interrupted supply chains for everything because people were sick, people were dying, nobody was moving the shipping containers, nobody was getting things to port, and therefore nobody was getting products to market. So there is always the potential for another large-scale global event. Other supply chain vulnerabilities speak to the fact that there are booms and busts in critical minerals mining. And what this means is that when there's demand, and there is ever increasing demand for lithium for electric vehicles, then you get market excitement and exuberance. That means you get a ramping up of supply, and then even while electric vehicles are booming in China, in Europe, and in parts of North America, you can still see an overabundance of lithium being produced, which is depressing prices because there's too much, even though there is high demand. So you get a boom and bust mentality in some of these minerals, which means investment-wise, people are concerned that they're not going to get the full recoup for their investment. So people talk about these as being relatively immature markets compared to other metals and minerals like iron ore, for example, which has very steady demand and well-established markets. So if we think about investment, that can be considered risky. If we think about the fact that there is still nowhere near as much investment put in by governments, let alone industry, compared to fossil fuels, which continue to be subsidised by countries around the world, including in Australia, then this raises concerns about the supply chain. So we have vulnerabilities from geopolitical tensions, we have vulnerabilities from the potential for more global events, we have vulnerabilities around investment in immature markets, and then we also have concerns about alternatives. Because at this point we are dependent on these minerals, but we do need to start thinking about a future where we don't depend on minerals like lithium. And so future investments really are considering, well, how long before we don't need lithium in our batteries? And they're already testing to consider whether or not we do or can substitute some of these minerals out of the renewable energy technologies that we so desperately need. And so this raises questions about supply chain vulnerability because all of these factors do play into our futures. So when we talk about the renewable energy transition, we do need to recognise that this dependence on critical minerals and metals for solar, wind, lithium-ion batteries, solar primarily being the largest or the single fastest growing renewable energy technology, we do need to consider that it is dependent on mining. And mining is not generally a clean industry, right? It's a dirty business. You've got to dig up minerals and metals from out of the ground. And this creates what some people have called the dark side of renewable energy. So when we talk about the dark side, what we're of course talking to is the fact that mining, the extraction of these minerals and metals out of the ground, can lead to a number of environmental and social impacts, negative impacts. A lot of lithium, Australia's the world's largest lithium exporter, 57% is extracted here, but a lot of lithium is also extracted in what's called the lithium iron triangle in Latin America. So we're talking about countries like Chile. And these have significant impacts because of the type of minerals processing. In Australia, we dig up hard rock mining. We just dig it out of the ground. We need a lot of big technologies and industries. In Chile, it's a process of evapotranspiration. It's coming up through the water to separate the lithium. And what this means is that a great deal of toxins can actually leach into the water, can leach into the soil, and can actually be absorbed into the skin. So indigenous communities in Chile quite often are immediately adversely impacted by the extraction process. We can see the same in terms of digging up cobalt in the DRC, nickel extracted in Indonesia, rare earth elements being processed in Malaysia. So these are the dark sides: ecotoxicity, the potential for a significant amount of hazardous waste that is very, very hard to dispose of in a safe way, and of course impacts on Indigenous communities. So these are the communities whose lands are primarily where extraction of critical minerals and metals are taking place. And researchers have identified at least 57% of the minerals needed for the renewable energy transition are on or near Indigenous lands. And so this raises questions about what's called free, prior and informed consent. This is a UN declaration recognising that Indigenous peoples should have the right to be informed about what people want to do on their lands, that this should be free, there should be no coercion involved in determining what is happening to that land, and that there should be consent. That is, that Indigenous peoples have the right to say no if they don't want their lands being degraded and harmfully impacted by extraction for renewable energy. And so this is where the current debate is at. How do you manage these tensions between the urgent need to grapple with the climate crisis, transition away from fossil fuels into much cleaner energy technologies, but in a way that doesn't contribute to negative impacts and doesn't leave people worse off than they used to be? And so we're now at the forefront of trying to understand better ways of engaging with Indigenous communities, providing them with energy security, as well as the co-benefits, what people talk about as co-benefits from this type of industrialisation. So if you can, I think of ways in which communities can be part of the transition rather than just suffering the harmful effects, then this will lead towards a much more sustainable and more just energy transition. So if you're interested in learning more about critical minerals, there's a whole range of things that you can look for. There are short interviews that I've done with colleagues from around the world, experts in the European Union and Latin America, for example. I've also got some blogs that talk specifically about what this transition means for Australia, and I'll be putting those in the description. Thanks for watching.